Hey there, welcome to this episode of the Cutting Room Floor. This is where we get to dig a little bit deeper into a part of the text or part of a message that maybe we just couldn't get into in the message. Not long ago here at Sunny Slope, we looked at a passage in First Corinthians chapter 9. And in First Corinthians 9, there's a lot of things that Paul is saying. One of the ideas that he really focuses on is how in his is like his missional strategy, how in his work as a missionary, he learns to adapt his methods, his ministry methods, in order to better communicate the gospel. Now we call this contextualization, and contextualization is when we take the essence of the gospel and we find ways to present it and to bring it to people so that they can hear it in their own culture and against their own sort of cultural and personal background. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 that he aims to be all things to all people so that he might win some to Christ. That's contextualization, and we see that in Paul's ministry, and I touched on this in the message. We see it when Paul speaks to the Athenians. He's talking philosophy with them. He's appealing to their poets and to their prophets. And when Paul is engaging a Jewish audience, he's speaking Old Testament scripture to them. He's appealing to what we would say to the Bible. And so whether Paul is with philosophers or he's with like religious people, he's tailoring his presentation of the message. And this is something that is so essential for us to do today, especially as our culture changes. We can no longer assume that we are working from a common religious or theological background, or even a common moral background when we engage other people with the message of the gospel. And so what we have to learn to do as Christians, and I think this is going to be increasingly important as we move forward, we are going to have to learn to contextualize the message. Now, some people hear that and they automatically assume that what you're doing and what we have to do is change the heart of the message. We have to somehow compromise. And so people get rather skittish about that. They get a little bit worried that somehow we're going to water down the truth of the gospel, or somehow try to hide the essence of Scripture in order to win people over. Now, that's not what Paul is talking about. That's not contextualization, and that's not what you and I need to be doing. What we actually see Paul in Paul is what I think we can call a firm but flexible approach. In other words, we see in Paul's ministry that there are certain truths that Paul holds very tightly to and that he's not going to compromise. Paul is not going to compromise, for example, on the sufficiency of Christ as the hope of our salvation. And anytime that Paul sees that threatened, for example, in the Galatian church, to a lesser extent, but still in the Corinthian church and in the Colossian church, Paul, he doesn't compromise on that. He doesn't water that down. He maintains and insists upon the sufficiency of Christ for our salvation. But what we do see again is that he takes those non-negotiables and he finds a way to present them in a way that the culture or the people that he's dealing with will be able to understand them. And he's doing that often in ways that we don't even immediately recognize because we may not be as familiar with the culture of the first century. I'll just give you one really quick example on that. When Paul speaks to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians, he talks about being that the gospel is a treasure in jars of clay. And of course, what Paul is doing, he's not just using fancy metaphors there. He's actually speaking to a culture in which was known for their clay, for their production of pottery. And so that's just a very simple example of Paul contextualizing, Paul communicating the message in a way that resonates with the people that he's speaking to. Now, for us to do this today, as I said, I think this is one of the most important things that you and I need to learn to do so that we can communicate the message to an increasingly secular culture. What this requires of us, it requires, first of all, that we know our culture well. It requires that we are really good cultural critics. It requires that we hear the messages of our culture and that we learn to evaluate them and critique them, not just bashing them, not just criticizing every part of what we see in our culture, but actually learning to discern the message and then evaluate it, and then show how the gospel offers a better alternative to this. And then to look to the longings and the hopes and the needs and the dreams of our culture, and show how Christianity speaks to that. The gospel speaks into this. Now, the question is, how do we do this? So if you want to be a good cultural critic, how do we do this? One of the books that I think is really quite good on this, Kevin Van Hooser has written a very good book on this that's worth considering, worth reading. And in that book, I should get the name of it, but he suggests a number of things that we need to learn to do. The book that he writes is Everyday Theology. That's the name of it, by Kevin Van Hooser. And he explains how to do this in much more detail than I can do here. But I want to just suggest a couple of ways that you can learn to do this. First of all, you've got to recognize that when we talk about culture, we are talking about, we're not just talking about sort of things like the symphony or, high fancy music. We're talking about everything that a group of people produces. And so culture can include everything from, the chair that I'm sitting in, the computer, the phone, the technology around me. All of that is a product of our culture, but it also includes the music. It includes the podcasts that you listen to. It includes the books that you read, the movies that you watch, the artwork that you appreciate. The work that we do, the vocation that we do, is also wrapped up in culture. So culture is everything that we produce that sends a message and makes meaning of the world around us. In other words, the way that I describe it is that culture is really a story that we are telling about what is important and valuable in this world. Culture is really a way that we try to make sense of the world around us. So if you go on a march, a couple of days ago was MLK Day, if you participate in a march or a demonstration, that is a cultural product. That is a narrative. You're actually telling a story about something that matters and something that's important. You might be expressing lament over what's wrong in the world and expressing a hope for something better. If you listen to music, you are listening to a product of culture. You're listening to something that expresses what matters or doesn't matter in the world, and what we ought to do to fix it, or what we can't do to fix it, depending on the music or the song that you're listening to. So culture, these things all are expressing culture. They're all these cultural products, and they're telling a story. They're making sense of the world. So we have to recognize, first of all, that all culture communicates. And so the first thing, if you want to contextualize the gospel, what you need to do is learn to be a good listener. You need to learn to listen to the messages of our culture. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in just a moment. The other thing that culture does is it creates structure, it creates order for our world. It sets priorities, it sets things that matter and things that are important, and it tells us what we ought to be looking out for and pursuing and ignoring, and how we ought to arrange and structure our lives to find and to live into what one version or a proposed version of what is the good life. So culture tells us about what we think should, or let's say it this way, culture communicates a proposal about what makes us joyful, what will bring happiness, what will bring meaning. And if, to the extent that we buy into that or not, then we order our lives around that message, and we structure our own lives around that, and we structure the broader institutions of society around that, based on what we think is meaningful and has purpose and significance. So So and there's more to it than that, but I think those are a couple of the important ones, that culture communicates and culture creates structure and order individually and socially. So one of the things that you need to do if you're a Christian, then you need to learn to be a good listener, and then I think you need to learn to ask some questions. And um, I think one of the ways to look at this is to follow along the Greek philosophers had, and I'm borrowing here from them. There's probably other ways you could do this, but the Greek philosophers had a series of questions that you would ask as a way of evaluating culture. And I think that even though they weren't working from a Christian framework, they offer some helpful insight into how do you evaluate culture, how do you evaluate ideas, and they would ask the questions: is it they would focus on truth, beauty, and goodness. And I think that gives us a launching pad for how you and I can not only listen, but also evaluate our culture. So I'm going to start with beautiful. I think one of the simple questions that we can ask, whether we're watching a movie, listening to a piece of music, watching a baseball game or a hockey game, you ask the question, is it beautiful? Is the quality pleasing? I think it's, and that kind of raises the question, then how do you define what is beautiful and what is appealing and aesthetically appealing? But I think that's a good place for Christians to start, because we acknowledge that God is the source of all beauty. God is the origin of what is beautiful. And so if we can learn to recognize what is beautiful, I think there's importance in that. We can learn to appreciate for example, you watch a movie, and if it's well done cinematically, if you've got good camera work, and if you've got good music as a soundtrack, and good and quality acting, I think that has value, that has importance. I think as Christians, sometimes the tendency has been to downplay the quality, the beauty of artistic work in favor of what we'll talk about in a minute, which is truth and goodness. In other words, the tendency was always like, you know what, it doesn't matter if the quality of the music is good, as long as there's, preaching a good moral, as long as there's a good moral message to the movie or to the TV show or to the music. And so you would get like Christian movies that were produced where the acting was really terrible, and where the overall quality of the plot and so on was very simplistic and just not very well done. And people would look at that and say, well, you know what? At least there's a good Christian message. And I think as Christians, we ought to critique that. We ought to be opposed to that. Instead, we ought to find value in aesthetic quality. We want to pursue what is beautiful, because that is pleasing to God. Good quality work is actually a credit to God. And by the way, that also, I think it also challenges us, and it helps us. It challenges us to learn to appreciate something that we might not, even if we don't like it. In other words, I always, I've said this to my kids before, they listen to my music. They don't particularly care for it, like, jazz or blues. And what I'll challenge them to do is say, okay, if you don't like it, you don't have to like it, but can you at least appreciate the beauty of it? And I think there's something important in that. The second question, so to listen to our culture, I think one of the things you can start with is ask the question, is it beautiful? Is there some aesthetic quality here that is worthy and admirable? The second thing is it true? And when we're asking the question, is it true? What you're doing is you're learning to evaluate the underlying message of a cultural product, and you're learning to discern the narrative story. And I don't just mean, can you follow along with a movie plot or TV show plot? What you need to do is listen to what does this program here tell us? What is the message it's sending about what gives life meaning and purpose? What is this song telling us about what is it proposing about what's wrong with the world? Right? Because often movies and TV shows and music, especially theater, will present a vision for what the problem is in the world, and then how to fix that problem. And so you need to learn to listen to that. You need to learn to ask the question, what does this show saying the problem is? What is it proposing that our hope for fixing it is? What is it saying about what our destiny is? And I'm using movies and TV shows and music as an example, but you can do this if you're standing, and if you're at Sunny Slope, you've heard me use this example before. If you're standing in the line at the grocery store and you pay attention to what's in line at the checkout, they have magazines and things. All of those often will tell you, they'll set an ideal for what matters. Even if it's just like a fashion magazine, that's telling you, that's presenting an ideal to you. It's presenting an ideal of beauty, and it's telling you that this figure is desirable and it's good, and therefore it's sort of creating an idealized body type, for example. And the fact that these images are airbrushed and completely cleaned up and changed, it's presenting a vision of what is of what our ideals ought to be. And then beneath that is a suggestion as to what's wrong with the world, which is, you don't look like that. You need to live into this standard of what beauty and attractiveness is. And it's presenting a vision for hope. Again, fashion magazines are elevating the ideals of beauty and glamour and glitz as what is really wrong and what we ought to be living for in this world today. So the first question you ask, is it beautiful? Is there aesthetic quality here? Is there something that's worth that's of beauty here? The second question is this true? What is the underlying narrative? What is this cultural product telling us about what matters, what is wrong, how to fix it, what are we living for? And then the final question, is it good? Is it good is the question of morality, essentially. What is the moral message? What is this telling us about right and wrong? What is the moral framework from which this movie, song, TV show, artwork is operating from? And when you do that, it's actually you begin to see that you begin to pull out different moral codes. It might be the subjectivism of individualism, like whatever's right for you is right, and you ought to follow your dreams and do what's right based on your own eyes. Is morality defined by the community? What is the definition of justice, and how do we seek after justice, and what is because justice is really an expression of what is good in the community, and how do we pursue that? And so you begin to evaluate, what does this tell me about morality, right and wrong, and the moral framework and the moral code that's at work. Once you do that, so once you've listened to the culture, once you've listened to the longings and the hopes and the fears and the what's wrong and how to fix it kinds of questions, then what you need to do is you need to compare that to the Christian narrative. You need to be able to show that the Christian story offers a far superior version or a superior answer. Now, what's interesting is you actually often find that in many cultural products, you find, like movies and things, you find that a compelling story often gets pretty close to the Christian narrative. I'll give you just a favorite example of mine. The movie Gran Torino with Clint Eastwood is a story that number one, it's just masterfully done. The quality of cinematography and so on, and the acting is really top notch. But then you actually find out the what's wrong with the world, and there's racial questions tied into that, and then there's like the questions of vengeance, and when one person does you wrong, how do you deal with that problem? How do you deal with being wronged by someone else? And how do you do you forgive? Do you get vengeance? And then the surprising question, without giving away too much of the plot, is that ultimately it's pointing to self-sacrifice and laying down of a person's life as the means for atoning for a sin and putting an end to the cycle of vengeance. And then you can go from there, and that's just one example, but then you go from there and you actually say, why do we find that story so compelling? And it has to do with the fact that, well, actually, there's where you see a picture of what the gospel is all about. You actually see a sort of a gospel pattern baked right into that movie. But then you can also critique it. You can also say, are there weaknesses to this, and how does the Christian story speak into that? And this is again, this is exactly what Paul is doing in his ministry. And again, I'll return and I'll finish up with the reference to the book of Acts when Paul is in Athens. This is exactly what he's doing. He's quoting the poets of Athens, the Stoic and the Epicurean philosophers. He's quoting them. And he's affirming something in there, and then he's challenging it. He's offering a better alternative that the Christian faith holds. And he's doing that as a way of drawing people into the greater story of Christianity. And in doing that, Paul says, I become all things to all people that some might be saved. That's our goal as well as Christians. We need to learn to be good cultural critics, to be good cultural, to listen to the poets and the prophets of our age, and to speak the Christian message into those longings in the world around us. Thanks for watching. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe to the video, and that way you won't miss any content here. Thanks for watching.